Hi there, everyone. So this is just a quick look at some of the other issues besides in the American Southeast that took place during the Reconstruction era. Because while the period from 1865 until the 1880s is often focused on issues between the South and the former Confederacy, there's a lot of other things that are going on in the United States. And for example, if this was a course in Texas, or if this was a high school in California, we'd be learning a heck of a lot more about these subpoints than we have here on the New York State Region Standards. So there's a lot of things to get into, but this is a very, very brief surface look at some of the circumstances, efforts, and impacts of these other efforts that took place amidst Reconstruction. First and foremost, the women's suffrage movement continued to really gain steam throughout the time of Reconstruction. And it's right to not just think of it as women will suddenly emerge with the right to vote in the 1920s, but there's a long and many thoughtful efforts that take place in this Reconstruction era. This goes back even to, of course, the roots of the feminist movement in the United States, involving abolition, involving temperance, the anti-alcohol movement, which tied into with the women's suffrage movement. Of course, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the Seneca Falls Convention was a watershed moment for the U.S. Women's movement. And these efforts are joined by others such as Sojourner Truth, and of course, Susan B. Anthony, who can't be understated when we talk about, especially during Reconstruction, major efforts, protests, intentional arrests, widespread literature, and organizing to gain women the right to vote. Alongside this effort to gain the right to vote, women are also involved in the temperance movement or the anti-alcohol movement. This will come to a key during Prohibition, where the main impact of the temperance movement is to actually gain a constitutional amendment to outlaw alcohol across the entire United States. But this short-lived amendment has to be thought about alongside the women's suffrage movement as a major effort of women at the time period. This is not just an effort by American women. This is an effort that women across the world took on to both outlaw alcohol and gain the right to vote at the same time. You see that especially in the United States, the circumstances that were the most receptive to women gaining the right to vote were out west. These are states like Wyoming. These are states like Utah, where women were given equal suffrage well before anywhere in the East, well before most of the major 13 original states. And that's why the women's right to vote really was spearheaded not just by the movers and shakers in New York and Chicago and so on, but also by the frontier women who gained the right to vote and really set an example of successful women's suffrage before it became a national amendment in 1920. So, of course, this is going to be an effort that continues on into the Gilded Age, into the Progressive era, since Reconstruction only lasts until 1877. But shortly after Reconstruction, many of the early leaders of the women's rights movement pass away. This means that there is a new generation that needs to take up the mantle and really spearhead this effort to give women the right to vote. And we'll look at some of these suffragettes and suffragists in upcoming units. At the same time as women were fighting for the right to vote and Reconstruction was going on, Manifest Destiny was really coming to a head out west with the Homestead Act and the granting of acres of lands to both businesses and individuals in order to expand the railroad and accompany the railroad with widespread settlement in the northern west. This not only industrialized the nation and led towards the industrial revolution and the Gilded Age, but it also, of course, meant major clashes with the Native Americans. And huge effort of this time period, along with the Dawes Act, are several military campaigns against Native Americans throughout the Northwest, throughout the Midwest, throughout the Southwest, on Native American territory, reservations that had been reserved for those Native Americans. And of course, taken away from them, despite previous promises to the otherwise. So there's major efforts to take more and more land from the Native Americans that accompany the Homestead Act. And These are going to be widely successful military campaigns against the Native Americans. Many of the short-lived Native American victories are answered with massive massacres and destruction of Native American life and culture, because as many of the Native American tribes are forced to surrender and are indoctrinated into these acculturation programs, these schools to try to erase the Native American heritage, there's both a widespread loss of Native American land and sovereignty, and also a widespread loss of Native American culture throughout the Western United States, as it happened in the Eastern United States. In addition, Chinese immigrants who had come to America on the West Coast, mostly in efforts to establish businesses and, of course, gain employment in the railroad, came to a head during Reconstruction, and then, of course, into the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, where clashes with white Americans, especially in the Bay Area, turned violent. This results in one of the first anti-immigration efforts of the so-called Progressive Era, the Chinese Exclusion Act, one of the first actions aimed against a group of immigrants to the United States. This also comes at a time where out west, many Mexican Americans are getting persecuted as well, because after the Mexican Cession at the end of the Mexican-American War, thousands of Mexicans became Mexican Americans. And even though there were some short-lived successes, such as like a governor of California, Romualdo Pacheco, who also served in the House. This is an interesting story because even though Pacheco is often looked at as like a success of the idea that right as Reconstruction is ending, Mexican Americans are able to hold such a high public office. For example, in 1876, he wins the House election to become a representative in the state of California, but the election is contested. Pacheco's victory is scrutinized and overturned. Even though he is able to gain re-election, or some would just say election, later on after Reconstruction, it really symbolizes the I don't want to say downfall, but it's like this plight of Mexican Americans who are also persecuted and ostracized out in the West. This involves especially many Native American, Mexican Americans, such as the Apaches, who were taken prisoner, and of course violence in places like Texas, throughout the South and Southwest against Latinos. This idea of like Juan Crow segregation is a real thing that we never talk about in New York. But it also really goes to show that many of these circumstances and efforts were really geared against both Mexican Americans, Mexican Native Americans, and the Chinese immigrants, especially at a time period when immigration was growing in the United States, not as much as in the Progressive Era and Gilded Age, but following the Civil War, immigration is growing throughout the United States, and it's not as many of the typical English and not even in out west the same amount of German or Irish immigrants coming to the United States. Even though in New York, many of the immigrants are coming in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era from different countries in Europe. It's a different ethnic group than in the early 1800s. And also the circumstances that these European immigrants are met with is very different than the ones that the Chinese Americans and that the Native Americans and the Mexican Americans face. For example, the party politics in the major cities in the East, in Chicago, Tammany Hall, and Boss Tweed in New York, these corrupt political machines really work to make efforts to gain the loyalty of newfound immigrant groups from Europe, while immigrant groups from Mexico, Native Americans, and the Chinese Americans are totally excluded